I'm going to go ahead and start with our introduction. So I'm Lydia Olander from the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, and I'd like to welcome you to the first session of a new webinar series called the National Climate Resilience Framework: From Ideas to Action. This series is a prelude to related sessions planned for the National Adaptation Forum. This webinar will be recorded and posted online next week, and the recording link will be sent to everyone that registered. And if we have time at the end for audience questions, we'd love for you to put them in the Q&A box. So you should be able to see that link at the bottom of your screen and add your questions there. And we will look at those at the end of the session, and hopefully we'll have time for a few. This webinar series will share information and progress related to the National Climate Resilience Framework released in September of 2023, the first ever National Climate Resilience Framework. And the series will bring together experts from government, nonprofit, and private sectors to discuss elements of the framework and how to implement it. Sessions will be hosted by a variety of partners. So sign up for our mailing list if you'd like to hear more about future webinar sessions in this series. The series is being hosted by the Resilience Roadmap Project, which is a nonpartisan independent project hosted by the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. Currently, the Resilience Roadmap is working on tracking and reporting progress on resilience, building support for a multi-sector national resilience strategy, and providing a forum for discussions on key resilience topics. Now, I'd like to turn to and introduce our moderator, Alice Hill. She's the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. She served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council, where she led development of national policy. And she has co-authored 2 books on the topic of climate resilience. So Alice, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lydia. What an honor to be here for this first ever program on the National Climate Resilience Framework. And we have authors of that framework who are able to share with you their very important work. It was an historic step for the United States, and an important one from the perspective of the harm that climate change is already causing our country. 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded. It looks like 2024 will clock in as a close second or exceed 2023. In 2023, we had a record number of those so-called billion-dollar disasters. Those are the disasters that cost $1 billion or more to the United States, 28 last year. So the need to build resilience to the worst of climate impacts is growing. It's growing quickly. And that's why it's such an important event here today to discuss the federal efforts to address this challenge. Last fall, the U.S. government released this National Climate Resilience Framework, setting forth a vision for climate resiliency across the country. It's hard to understate what an important step this was, given that there was no place we could turn to get an overview of all the efforts that the United States has underway and what could be done to build greater resilience in our country. Now, joining us today to give opening remarks and explain this framework and its importance is Brenda Mallory, Chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. At CEQ, she is responsible for leading many of the efforts on resilience in the Biden administration. Chair Mallory, it's my honor and pleasure to turn it over to you now to share with us this important document.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alice, and also thank you to Lydia for kicking this webinar off. I'm excited to actually be part of this event because I think it will be a really important way to make sure that folks on the ground are connecting around some of the themes that we identified in the framework, and that we can actually work more closely with people to ensure that there are benefits to the resilience ecosystem from the work that we're all doing. Quickly, let me thank Lydia just for the webinar and thank Alice for the introduction, but also wanted to thank the Duke University's Nicholas Institute for presenting this webinar series and for all the incredible work that Duke and the Nicholas Institute have done around climate resilience. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be here to just focus on what the president has laid out as the agenda for resilience. I'm also just really grateful for all the dedicated partners across the country, many of whom I know are tuning in today. People who are in the nonprofit area, who are in philanthropy, who are in academia, and the private sector as well. The really important work that you all do on the ground is essential for ensuring that we can protect our communities for generations to come. And so I think some of the details we'll hear in the panel discussion afterwards will be the beginning of that conversation. This audience knows too well that the world is facing unprecedented challenges as far as climate change is concerned and how it is driving increasingly frequent and ferocious extreme weather events, leaving communities all across the nation vulnerable. I begin my mornings listening to Al Roker and looking at his map, which is turned into a daily reminder of how extreme our weather patterns have become. Just today, he was focused on Midwest blizzard warnings that are occurring in places that have already received over a foot of snow. And in the South was focused on really heavy rain and tornadoes in places that were, had a washout over the weekend. So cities and towns are really at risk from frequent hurricanes, from floods, from power outages, and persistent droughts. And in that context, we see our rivers, our lakes, our wetlands, and other freshwater resources that are fundamental to the health and prosperity and resilience of the nation and sacred to many tribes are also being threatened. A decades-long effort to undermine Clean Water Act safeguards culminated in the United States Supreme Court's harmful decision last year in the United States versus Sackett. And Sackett represents one of the largest judicial rollbacks of environmental protections in U.S. history and really undermines our efforts to make communities more resilient. Last week, the United Nations World Meteorological Organization sounded a red alert because average temperatures have reached their highest in the 174 years of record keeping. And Alice already started talking about how 2023 really marked a year in which every kind of major global climate record was broken. She mentioned the 28 disasters that were over $1 billion. We also saw last year that in Maui, one of the most serious wildfires that really tore through parts of that island, destroying many homes and livelihoods. And historic Lahaina bore much of the brunt of that particular storm. In the South and Midwest, extreme drought plagued the nation's breadbasket, threatening crop yields. Along the East Coast, historically intense storms flooded towns, separating families from loved ones and essential services. And so we can see that the impacts are really occurring all across the country. But one thing we do know is that the most severe harms from climate change fall disproportionately on communities that are least able to prepare for, recover from those disasters. So President Biden's climate resilience agenda and the administration's efforts writ large have really placed environmental and economic justice at the center of the work that we have been doing, protecting every community in harm's way and really striving for a safe, healthy, equitable, and economically strong future for all. The president's agenda is backed by his Investing in America agenda, where a record $50 billion is being delivered to advance climate resilience strategies in communities across the nation. including in communities that we know are the most vulnerable. And then through his America the Beautiful initiative and the Global Fresh Water Challenge, President Biden is delivering on the first national conservation goal to protect at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, accelerating locally led efforts to tackle the world's intertwined water, climate change, and nature crises. Alice mentioned the release last fall of the first National Climate Resilience Framework to really identify key values and priorities and objectives to expand and accelerate comprehensive, locally tailored, and community-driven climate resilience strategies. This framework is ambitious and envisions a climate resilient nation as one that is able to cope, adapt, and evolve in the face of the current and future climate conditions, meeting the climate challenges of today and preparing for climate-related shocks and stresses of tomorrow. So we're at a pivotal moment in the race to protect our communities against climate change. And as last year's actions or events taught us, the stakes could not be higher. Working in partnership with folks like all of you who are listening on this webinar and beyond, I personally am just optimistic that we can build proactive solutions that prepare communities for the future and ensure that we have the resources in place for that recovery. The work set out in the National Climate Resilience Framework requires an all-hands-on-deck effort. It's going to take all of us working together to deliver on the necessary climate resilience goals laid out by the president in order to protect communities. So I just thank you for inviting me to help kick off the panel, and thank you for all of the work that is being done by many to build a more resilient and equitable future for all.
Thank you so much, Chair Mallory. It's really exciting to have heard about your work and the work of CEQ and others in the department and, in the White House, as well as the need to achieve resilience across many sectors. It was really interesting to hear the legal system mentioned, because I think that is where increasingly battles are going to come, both in trying to curb regulation from the administration, but also to find corporations liable for their actions in contributing to the climate crisis. So interesting days ahead. Now it's my honor and pleasure to be able to introduce the rest of the panel. We are joined by Crystal Bergman, the Senior Director for Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We also have Ann Miller, the Director of the Colorado Resiliency Office. And last but not least, we have Roy Wright, the President and CEO of the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. We are really in great hands today. So Crystal, I'm going to turn to you first, because I know that you have worked hard, as well as with Lydia and many others, as Chair Mallory noted, on the National Climate Resilience Framework. So could you share a little bit more what that framework looks like, and what are some of the details that this audience should know about?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Alice, and thank you again. I echo my thanks to the Nicholas Institute and the Resilience Roadmap, and of course others on this call who are not only joining here today to help make this webinar series possible, but who really helped make this National Climate Resilience Framework possible. This really took a lot of input and communication and conversations and discussion from the broader resilience and adaptation community. So thank you so much for everyone who helped make this possible. And I will try to talk as little as possible, because I'm selfishly eager to hear from my fellow panelists who have so much to say and so much to contribute about how can we actually make this, turn this vision into reality on the ground. We can go to the next slide. I've got a few slides. So the framework, as we heard, was released last September. This is as we heard, the first ever National Climate Resilience Framework, it really highlights a vision for what a resilient nation looks like, the foundation for near and long-term resilience efforts, not just from the federal government, but in coordination with non-federal partners. So all of you, go to the next slide. One of the things I think is so critical about this work is that it articulates a common definition of resilience, but also goes beyond that to talk about the definition of a climate resilient nation. And in that definition, talks about a climate resilient nation needs to have safe and affordable housing, needs to have flourishing natural ecosystems, healthcare, affordable, sufficient food supplies, clean water, education, all of these things that we know in our communities we need, and explicitly tying them to, we cannot be resilient communities unless we are thinking about these systems as interconnected and we have all of these pieces in order to thrive. Go to the next slide. Another piece that I think is really critical to the framework, and the framework is 30 pages, it's a tight 30 pages. I'm not gonna go through everything today, but certainly recommend if you haven't seen it or you don't have it. It's a tight read, so you can flip to any page and find something good in there. So, but one of the key things that I think is critical is that the framework also identified principles, and these principles are identified in order to guide federal government action and approach to achieving resilience. So that means when the federal government is thinking about climate resilience and climate resilient solutions and programs and policies, it needs to be thinking about these principles. So that means proactive, implementing solutions that anticipate and address climate threats and impacts before damages occur. A whole system, thinking about, like I mentioned just a moment ago, how communities and systems and natural systems are interconnected, that resilient solutions need to be equitable and just, that we're not exacerbating disparities, that they should be people-centered, that we need to be taking the well-being of individuals and families, not just property, but what that really means to communities and human beings and residents of those properties. That this work should be collaborative and inclusive. We should be working across sectors. This work needs to be durable. The solutions we implement need to serve current needs, but also future needs. And then finally, these solutions all should be multi-benefit. So we need to be prioritizing those solutions that enhance climate resilience, but also have other benefits for communities, for economic and social, societal objectives, and that we're not creating maladaptive solutions that may solve one problem while making another one worse. So go to the next slide. So a lot packed into this next slide. In addition to this reimagining the federal government's role in advancing climate resilience, the framework also identifies these 6 core objectives. And these objectives are supported by specific actions that the federal government is undergoing now, but also opportunities for action, 53 of them that are areas where we can strengthen the nation's protections against the impact of climate change. So the first one is embedding climate resilience into planning and management. That means when you think about a climate resilient nation, we need to be thinking about climate considerations alongside other considerations. In planning, management, policy processes, we need to be thinking about climate variability and weather extremes and how they're associated with impacts to people along the natural built environment. So this planning really needs to be integrated into all the other planning that happens and should be coordinated and more streamlined. So one of the things the federal government should be doing, and the framework calls on the federal government to do, and we're working on, is to find ways to better harmonize planning requirements for federal funding across agencies, and also calls on the federal government to strengthen our interagency coordination before and after a disaster. The second objective really focuses on the built environment. So thinking about the built environment, both for acute climate shocks and chronic stressors. Climate resilience really needs to be a key consideration in our planning and design for land use and the built environment. And that means adopting building codes. The federal government is working on the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes, working with state and local governments on modern building codes, making sure federal investments are built to last for the service life of an asset, and taking into account increasing threats. It also means not putting buildings, assets, facilities, or people in areas where they're most likely to be damaged or in harm's way. The third objective is about mobilizing capital, investment, and innovation to advance climate resilience at scale. And I know that our panelists will talk more about this later in the session, so very eager for that. But this is about increasing access to early stage capital for climate adaptation and resilience, supporting research to market pathways for innovators, expanding and exploring insurance solutions to improve climate resilience, including understanding how resilient codes and standards could lower insurance prices or increase access to insurance availability. I want to make sure that when you're talking about climate innovation, that we're putting resilience on the same footing as a lot of our mitigation investment and innovations as well. Fourth, equipping communities with information and resources. So we know there's lots of tools out there for climate resilience, lots of data out there, but this framework really calls on the federal government to work to make sure that that data is usable and available to communities in a way that makes sense, so that communities can use that information to make evidence-based but easy to use decisions with that information. So we know that communities need to have a way to use information and tools, and that means providing more technical assistance, more community engagement around those tools. 5, protecting and sustainably managing lands and waters. We know that investments in nature through conservation and restoration are critical for managing the impacts of climate change. They're also equally integral solutions to the climate crisis. Building a climate resilient nation requires effort to protect, restore, connect, and conserve the country's nature and natural systems. So a few actions here include requiring consideration of nature-based solutions for federal investments, wherever that's appropriate, working to establish government-wide design and planning criteria for nature-based solutions, and supporting a better understanding of what constitutes a nature-based alternative. And then finally, but definitely not least, is really, helping communities become more resilient is also about helping them become more safe, healthy, equitable, and economically strong. And that's linked to one of the principles that we saw earlier in the slide deck. A community's well-being is closely linked, their climate resilience is closely linked to their economic, social, physical well-being. And we know that communities with diverse economies, strong engagement, food security, access to essential services, all of those things mean that communities are going to be more resilient in the face of a disaster or climate threats. So, like I said, packed in those 6 objectives, there's 53 opportunities for action. Really looking forward to this discussion and this panel discussion to hear about ideas of what states and non-federal actors, what they need from the federal government, how we can work together to really make this a reality. So I'll close here, looking forward again to hearing from our panelists and all of you about working to realize this vision. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Crystal. As I said, really important blueprint for how to get this done, a call out for principles to guide our actions and the steps to get us really to a safer place. That intellectual property is of great value to states and to local governments, territorial governments, and we're so fortunate to have Anne with us. I want to turn to you now, Anne. You're joining us from the Colorado state government. Could you share just a bit about the role of state partnerships and why they're important to making this resilience effort really work? And what priorities do you see for states for climate resilience broadly and in using this framework to identify their goals?
Yes, and thank you. It's such an honor to join this panel today. Again, my name is Ann Miller, and I'm the director of the Colorado Resiliency Office. We're located in the Department of Local Affairs. I was very encouraged to see the federal government's release of the National Climate Resilience Framework last Friday. It was very affirming to the work we're doing in states. It demonstrates a commitment to reforming and modernizing federal programs and policies to strengthen climate resilience, and it was a real inspiration for me. This document provides a clear, concise framing of challenges and solutions, highlighting federal government accomplishments and opportunities for action. It covers a lot of ground in those 30 pages, so kudos again. I see alignment between the federal framework and our work in Colorado around those resilience principles you heard, key challenges, and areas of focus. In the coming year, we will be doing a 5-year update of the Colorado Resiliency Framework, a first of its kind back in 2015. There is synergy in the themes between the national and Colorado frameworks, including reducing risk from climate hazards in the built and natural environment, fortifying a future-ready economy and workforce, and building community capacity. I'll highlight some areas of the national framework that resonated with me in our work in Colorado, as well as topics of interest to state resilience leaders. The first framework objective on embedding climate resilience into planning and management is key, including strengthening interagency coordination and increasing access to climate resilience funding. Baking climate resilience into federal programs drives results at the state and local levels. For example, resilience is interwoven throughout the bipartisan infrastructure law, from energy grid reliability to wildfire risk reduction. Historic federal funding is spurring resilient projects on the ground, including the federal funding my office was able to leverage to grow our microgrids for community resilience grant program to support projects like resiliency hubs. In Colorado, state government has been partnering with federal agencies to help communities navigate the many funding opportunities, no small task. The second framework objective focuses on the built environment. I'm an urban planner, so I understand the importance of land use planning and reducing risk. It's critical that we build to withstand future climate conditions, including the framework action to enhance engineering and architectural standards, as well as for nature-based solutions. A couple opportunities for action that struck me in the third objective on investment and innovation include capturing indirect benefits as part of the cost-benefit analysis for projects, as well as federal leadership on insurance market, a growing concern across the country, which I'm sure we'll be covering today. Within the fourth objective on community resources and information, it's great to see the expansion of federal technical assistance program to help meet critical local capacity needs. It's also so positive to see that Thriving Communities Network focused on federal government technical assistance coordination. We work closely with local communities, so I was very encouraged to see that shared commitment to place-based, people-centered climate solutions with a focus on equity. I also see additional opportunities, though, for strategic alignment and coordination between federal and state agencies, and my office is more than happy to continue to partner in that work. There are so many great resources and tools that the federal government is putting out. I encourage efforts for agencies to curate easy-to-use resources and streamline across agencies to limit duplication. I support the framework action to enhance climate models as well, including addressing future population and land use to assess risks to communities and economies. Objective 5 focuses on sustainably managing lands and waters. And I enthusiastically support nature-based solutions we've heard about today across federal programs. In the West, we also value efforts to understand and integrate changing wildfire risks into resource management and mitigation actions. Finally, I applaud actions to grow a future climate-ready workforce, including expanding the Climate Corps program, where Colorado is a national leader. In summary, the National Climate Resilience Framework provides a strong foundation to further strengthen federal government partnerships to scale solutions to the urgent challenges we've opportunity to continue to team in this work. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's really interesting to see how your state government, your office, perceives this plan. Of course, we hear so much that resiliency, building resiliency, takes a whole of government, and I think that includes all levels of government. But it also is going to include the private sector, and that's why I'm going to turn now to Roy, who will represent the private sector. Insurance obviously has a federal component as well as some state components where plans are no longer available. But Roy is in the hot seat of determining how we can remain insured as a nation in the face of climate risk. I read today in one of our major journal media, they called the nation the uninsured nation. I don't think we're there yet, but we are really looking for solutions to how to make sure that this remains, that the United States sectors, certain sectors in the United States, geographic sectors, remain attractive to private insurers for providing property insurance, which is so key to our economy and to the well-being of families and people and businesses. So Roy, I'm going to turn it over to you. And can you speak about how the insurance sector is dealing with this issue of resilience and how it can make progress in ensuring that we are more resilient, so we're more insurable?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's great to be with you, Alice, and to share the this time with Chair Mallory, Crystal, Ann, and others. You know, I spent enough years inside the federal government that I understand that when a document like this comes out, it's no small feat. A number of us have been talking about the need at a national level to have a climate framework, something that would be cohesive and useful inside federal agencies, but also show how the private sector can then intersect in these pieces. And I look particularly at objective 2 and 3 in this document. I think as I think about the question that you've posed to me, Alice, I think in so many ways, as we look at about the impact of climate, it meets families in one of two ways. Either Mother Nature has barged through their front door. They've experienced the disaster. They've experienced loss. That could be a wildfire. That can be some kind of severe convective storm or hurricane. Or they meet the price of risk. And I think that's the element that often comes in interfaces on the property insurance front. And I want to talk about climate, but the price of property insurance is really driven up by three things. One of them is our increasing home equity, which some of us are pretty proud of as we see go up. There is the impacts of inflation, and then there are these additional disasters. These, particularly the $1 billion, we keep looking at these 28 events from last year. Those of those 28. 19 of them were severe convective storms. So you think about this in terms of how it's not just something that is about a wildfire you might see in California or Hawaii, or a hurricane that hit the Gulf Coast. These are elements that are meeting there. So most of you know this, but on the property side, flood is generally handled through the federal government, through the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm happy to dive into details on that. But on wind, rain, hail, and wildfire, that's the private sector. That's the private sector coming in and looking at risk, putting a price on it. Now, there's a lot of competition, you know, in the insurance world. There's a lot of commercials you can watch on TV. They want your business, and they particularly want good risk. They're also going to be there for the more extreme risks. Usually, though, that's met with a price, and that price might leave a sour taste in your mouth. So as I look particularly at objective 2, we see a whole lot of attention in objective 2 to what has not yet been built. The impact that we can have on building codes, and seeing that, you know, it's a sad fact that only about 35% of American jurisdictions use the modern building code. Those building codes originate here in the United States. We provide them for the rest of the world, yet only about a third of our communities have that. Most folks just presume their house was built to a code, and for a majority of us, that's not true. And so I think we have to be leaning into that space. We then have to find ways by which, when there is a federal nexus in terms of things like multifamily housing, affordable housing elements, that we're nudging the new construction to be able to withstand what we know can come our way. The other piece, and this is really at I think at the crucible in the property insurance world, a place where the science that I work on here at our organization at IBHS meets what the insurers do. And it's for what's already built. And I read this framework and look at how it points the way for us to retrofit. More than 99% of Americans live in something that was built more than 5 years ago. And so as we see increased intensity and frequency of some events, we see the impacts, whether that's of hail and rain, wind, flood, wildfires that have played out. How do we retrofit in that space? And I think that's an element that as those investments are made, we will see insurers meet that in terms of the price point. So I'm hopeful and I'm realistic all at the same time, understanding that we can lay out some national framing on this. But at the end of the day, this meets each individual family, Alice. Each individual neighborhood has choices to make in this space. So before I turn it back to you, I'll look at the thing related to Objective 3, which is the point by which private capital comes in. It's where the insurers play and make in underwriting risk and pricing risk. I think we're going to have to live in that uncomfortable space that the risk's going up, and you can't on the one side say the risk is going up and the price is going down. And we got to find ways to make it affordable because there's a housing need all across the country. All the kinds of questions, Alice, that I think really lead for us in this space. So let me turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Roy. And you're obviously right at the heart of where we are beginning to see the price of the damages from climate change. And I so appreciate your work in making sure that we do find solutions that will make this more attractive for the private market. So I want to turn now to a round robin, looking at a number of questions that get at how, first of all, with a framework like this, we've got actors identified, federal, state, local governments, the private sector, and there are a lot of other civil society players here that have great interests in making sure that we have a resilient nation, a resilient economy. How do we get all these players to work together in a meaningful way? It sounds good to say whole of government, whole of society. I think it's a lot harder to accomplish. What are your ideas on how we can meaningfully work together across these different sectors and lines of authority? Who wants to just speak up if you want to join in?
Yeah, I'll defer to Anne first, because I think really the
great.
forefront of communities matters principally, and then I can circle back on the private side.
Sure.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of great networks out there. So tapping into the existing networks, for example, I'm involved in several different state resilience leaders kind of peer networks. And in fact, we've had members of this team, Crystal's come and presented on the climate resilience framework. So to continue to tap into those where we can really be teaming and sharing information and solutions. And I think growing that too, it's not enough to just tap into the existing networks, but with resilience and harmonizing efforts, like you said, it's no small feat to be able to organize ourselves differently and think creatively about governance models. And that may mean throwing out some of the old and creating some new, where we bring together the major players from private to nonprofit to federal, state, and local governments. So I think we can get creative here.
Thank you. I agree. It's going to take some creativity and ingenuity to get over these jurisdictional boundaries, because we know that climate change doesn't honor any of them, and they actually can get in the way of planning. So Roy, what are your ideas?
I think, first of all, I take a political view of this, whether it's a city council, a board of supervisors, or a state legislature. There's choices that have to be made so that we don't see the problem get worse. I think about the building code side. I think about the infrastructure investments that are robustly funded through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Are we making sure that those dollars aren't just being spent in an adequate way, but is truly looking 20 and 30 years down the road? And I think that civil servant leaders can do a lot in this space. And I think the political leadership has to be at the foreground of this. It's the kind of leadership that we've had out of the Biden administration and from others in Congress. I think there are some governors that have really leaned in this space. And as I said earlier, most of our states don't even have a building code. And if we're not careful, even in convenings like this, we'll fall prey to simply admiring this problem as opposed to driving towards action. And so what does it look like to make sure that we're draining the water away? What does it mean for us to have the right kind of stormwater infrastructure in place? And then as we look at affordable housing, I actually think this is one of the hardest parts, yet one of the most important parts. There are housing needs in this country, whether that's multifamily housing or single family, that is growing in across states all across the country. Are we getting all of these pieces baked in so that as a homeowner, they can look over the next couple of decades and know that while the climate may impact their community, their home is going to be a safe space? And then I think we've got to find ways by which government grant dollars are helping those who can't afford to do the resilience retrofits. And then we find the right ways to nudge those who can afford to go do the right thing. We know how to build to withstand 140-mile-an-hour winds, yet we can't withstand 140-mile-an-hour winds. We know how to narrow the impact of wildfire ember storms in terms of when they attack communities to have fewer ignitions. We can't stop it entirely, but we can really narrow it down. But that requires existing homeowners to take different actions. Can we nudge in terms of the price considerations on the insurance side? Can we find pieces inside the tax code, both state and federal, similar to the energy efficiency incentives and credits that are in place? Can we do the same thing on resilience? And then the kind of leadership that Ann and her colleagues have played by which maximizing the dollars, whether those are federal dollars or state dollars, maximizing their impact so that fewer families will be disrupted or displaced by the next way that Mother Nature comes barging into town.
Absolutely, a wide panoply of solutions that I think gets at the heart of something you mentioned, the price on risk. And really the question going forward is who owns the risk? Is it the homeowner? Is it going to be property insurers? Is it going to be the state or the federal government? And right now it feels a little bit like we're passing a hot potato because no one wants to end up with the risk or it's too expensive to pay for the risk. Crystal, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'll just briefly, chime in. The president's Investing in America agenda means over $50 billion for resilience between the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So that means the federal government we are racing as fast as we can to get those dollars to communities that need them and can use them. And I think it's our role as a federal government to make sure that we're doing that in a way that gets to communities who are at the highest levels of risk, who are disproportionately impacted, but also making sure that that those dollars are focused on long-term resilience, that we're not just building for today, but building for the future, as Roy said as well. And so that is a lot of what the federal agencies are focusing on, and we're working here to make sure that they're coordinated with one another so that those programs are complementary. Those literally hundreds of programs work together, not at cross purposes. But where I think we need help from states and locals and non-government actors is helping tell the story of all those programs. There's still polls that show a lot of Americans don't know what resources are available to them, or many communities don't know what resources are available to them. and then helping us at the federal government, helping us understand, where are we falling short? Where can we do better in terms of getting the program's technical assistance to communities that need it, helping build the capacity. What is it that communities need? How can we do a better job of making sure the tools are usable so that communities can really do the work of implementing those programs?
Absolutely. We need to be providing a lot of information, help, in my opinion, to make sure that communities have sufficient ambition when it comes to climate change. One of the biggest perils out there, in addition to the climate worsened hazards, is that the human brain has a hard time imagining how large this could get, and also how an event could cascade to lead more damage. I'll just share an anecdote. There's a lot of debate about, or there was an article saying that earthquakes were worsened by climate change. I talked to a seismic engineer, and she told me, no, I don't think they're worsened. But what happens if you have a rain-soaked hillside and there's an earthquake, there's a landslide? And we just being able to think through, and then what does that building look like? What does that community look like? How do the insurers, Roy, in your work, take on that risk? So many uncertainties and so many things that we need to imagine that are basically unfamiliar to us. So I want to ask each of you, if you were appointed the climate resilience wizard for the nation, looking at all these different layers of government, what would your top 3 short-term priorities for moving forward the nation be? So I'll turn to Crystal, because you have probably maybe more time to think about this because you've been in government. So if you now, after working on this framework, what would you say? Yeah, we should march out right now on this.
Well, short term, like I said, we're working really hard to get dollars out, and I think that needs to continue to be the focus so that communities can make a difference. Thinking about, like I said, getting the right kinds of tools and the right kinds of support to communities to help them make decisions. And then I would say third, thinking about how can we bolster workforce? How can we make sure that there's the workforce, the staff, trained people out there to help communities, whether it's build more resilient buildings up to code, or create more resilient land to protect against wildfire. Making sure that we have ways to bolster our workforce to get this work done that we really need to do. It can be really, really critical.
Well, I think those are all great, and I think I would agree with them. But how about Roy or Ann? Do you have anything you would add or move to the top?
Maybe I would put it this way. I think some of them might resemble some pieces from Crystal, but I might frame them slightly differently. I think first and foremost, we need to take on the failure of imagination in this country. Alice, you introduced this. It's not just one event, they are compounding events. And by the time you deal with the effect of successive events that keep wearing down those pieces, some of those times you need to make investments, but oftentimes you just have to grow the adaptive capacity. We're an amazingly inventive culture here in the United States. And we need to help people, without turning this into fear-mongering, to imagine the kind of things that can happen. What happens when a pandemic is in play and then you have 2 hurricanes that come? What happens when you're still recovering from the spring flood and then the storm surge comes again? What happens when you're still dealing with the flooding events from the atmospheric rivers in California that then have opened you to more vulnerability of both wildfire and slide coming your way? I think when Americans are focused, they activate their political leadership and their locals. And so how do we get this? So that would be my first one. The second one is to double down on what Crystal hit. We have to activate around the dollars that are in play. I spent a decade and a half working as a civil servant in the government, most of that time at FEMA. We could have never dreamt of the level of investment that is made. I think President Biden referred to this as a once in generation, and that's not hyperbole. This is once in a generation investment. Put it into motion, put it into action, and increase the capacity and capabilities in communities to withstand. And the third piece, if I could look past this current investment of money, we need to be thinking about the future capital. What does it look like to actually see ongoing investment in housing, in infrastructure in this country, in something that really can be generative and move forward? I think this current investment through the bipartisan infrastructure bill is unique. We shouldn't expect that that's what's going to be in place in 2030. And so we need to find creative ways to keep the capital flowing and drive folks towards a more resilient future together.
Thank you. I agree. We got to get over ourselves and our failure to understand really the challenge that's posed by these risks. Anne, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to build on the comments already made. Obviously, the funding is key. We have it now. Let's use it wisely. Let's coordinate to be most impactful, really looking at the long term, how are we building out 50 years even from today, and streamlining across agencies, processes. Local governments are overwhelmed, state agencies are overwhelmed. So anything we can do to like streamline and really get the uptake for the real transformative work we want to see happen on the ground in communities. I would say that that flexible funding, I loved Crystal's opening comment about this puts adaptation on the same footing as greenhouse gas, mitigation efforts. And that's really important because we don't have the resources right now adequately addressing those needs. So I'm going to put a shameless plug out for my colleagues in other state resiliency offices that we would love to have some funding to scale our work to really accelerate this transformative effort that we are all trying to work on. So I'll just, close with that. I know we'll wrap it up here. I'll turn it back to you, Alice. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're going to have just a few minutes left, and I want to get at a question that came up in our question and answer from the audience. And this has been a matter that everyone has touched on, but we've got decisions being made on the ground by local communities that may not be so resilient, including by failing or deciding not to enact, as Roy said, the latest versions of the building codes, which, by the way, those building codes don't yet address the future risk of climate change, but you would likely be safer if you had the most modern version of the building codes, and land use practices to encourage that kind of investment on the local level, which studies from FEMA and the others have shown has dramatic payoff. For example, FEMA studies showed that for every dollar you spend on building codes, you saved $11 in damages. So what are some ideas to get over that hurdle, to encourage behavior or encourage choices that are invested in resilience, that turn towards resilience rather than remaining at the status quo, assuming that if we built things like we did in the past, it'll keep us safe? Long question. We need short answers because time is running out. So who would like to take that on? Anyone?
I'll jump in and be quick.
Sure.
I'll just say, tragically, over 100 million people in this country were in counties that were directly impacted by disasters. And so for better or worse, that means people are getting firsthand knowledge that that their communities might be at risk. And so I think, pairing that firsthand knowledge with more education about what's out there, what whether their community has a building code, for example, many do not, will help communities come together and make good decisions. So I think just working together to make sure that there's more education out there could make a big difference here by the right storytellers and by the right messengers.
Absolutely. When it's fresh in your mind, it's hard to ignore. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think building on recency bias, the good
Yeah.
side of it, hey, it happened, I need to do something, is critical. I think carrots help along this way, but carrots have to be sustained, and sometimes we'll dangle a carrot, hey, you've got to put the building code in place to get these kind of recovery funds. And I think at times, particularly after a community has been totally devastated, we're leery to lean too hard in on those kinds of things, knowing that they absolutely need help, the survivors, in coming back together again. I go back to this, just how do we see this happen? It's when individual citizens in a community see the value, and that's then what they demand of their local electeds and into their national electeds. And so what does it look like to not educate in a way that we got to send everyone back to school, but find ways in really pithy moments to go, this makes a difference. It may change the price today, but it lowers the operational cost going forward. I think this was pointed to in Objective 6 of the framework. When it saves on your electrical costs, when it saves on the ongoing cost of living, affects your budget, well, then you lean in, because some of these decisions, these choices, to be really honest with you, are cost neutral at the point of new construction. Right? It doesn't cost anything more. We just need to show them the way, and it will actually limit some of the budgetary impact on them in the years to come.
Absolutely. And Anne, you have the last word here.
So yeah, promoting that win-win, that people care about their communities. They want to protect their lives and livelihoods. They want to save money. They want to breathe cleaner air. There are co-benefits from all of the work we're talking about. And I'll end with that.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to the audience for joining us. We have the framework. We have champions who are leading the way. Crystal, Ann, Roy, Lydia, and Chair Mallory. So let's go out and do it now. I look forward to seeing how we can implement this framework to build the resilience we need. Thanks so much.